Hello! Okay, welcome back to the channel and thank you for joining me in, I was going to say celebrating, but it's not one of those lists, is it? But reflecting on film in 2024, and that is my top 10 worst movies of 2024. And I just want to start off with saying this list, like my top 10 favourites, it's purely subjective. There are going to be movies within this list that others enjoyed a hell of a lot more than me. Especially the first 5, I'd say, to be honest. I think the first 5 movies within this list aren't, for me personally, unwatchable movies. I didn't hate them, but they were okay. There was something I might have liked. There might have been a certain aspect about their stories or what it was they were attempting to achieve with them that I appreciated or liked, but they weren't particularly great either. They weren't great experiences. And I did find it very hard this year, actually, to sort of really compile a list. I mean, a lot of the movies that I consider to be technically really bad are movies that I'd actually forgotten about. And I had to do a lot of sort of digging back into the last year to sort of really rediscover those movies that I completely forgot about, which makes sense, really. I mean, if they're that bad, and there were a couple within the top 4 of this list that I had actually forgotten about until I revisited my reviews and sort of checked them out. And so yeah, I kind of found this list a little bit harder to compile because I felt like we had a pretty decent year last year when it comes to film. Yeah, we still had those stinkers.
That is one big pile of shit.
But there were still movies that I felt like weren't unwatchable. Like a lot of the movies in my list are movies that, I was able to sit through and appreciate certain aspects about them and what it was they were attempting with their stories. So yeah, before we dive into those top 10 worst movies of 2024 for me, there are 2 dishonorable mentions that I really want to talk about very briefly, or I'll try my best to. The first one being Godzilla x Kong. Now, I had a lot of fun with this movie, but it just wasn't for me. There are aspects about the film that I liked. It does tap into a certain era of kaiju movies pretty well, I felt, and I could see why a lot of fans of this genre really liked the movie and enjoyed it perhaps a hell of a lot more than I did. It wasn't an unpleasant experience, like I just said, it was fun, but it wasn't my kind of kaiju movie. It's definitely a movie that's going to cater or work for certain fans within this genre of, for kaiju movies, but for me, yeah. And the one that just missed out on being my number 10, I was actually quite torn between these movies, but yeah, it just misses being my number 10 worst movie, and that is part 1 and part 2 of Rebel Moon, the director's cut. Now, like I said, I'm going to try and keep this brief. Like, I'm a massive fan of Snyder. He's a fantastic storyteller when it comes, from a visual perspective, but the man can't write. And I felt like the director's cut of the first movie, or the part 1, worked a hell of a lot better than the original cut, and I just found myself being immersed within the world that Snyder was attempting to bring alive. I loved the world building, and that is something that I really adored about this movie, part 1 and part 2. It's one story, and so I really appreciated that aspect, but unfortunately, as soon as a character opens their mouth, it just skyrockets. The writing is so terribly bad in these movies. Like, I couldn't give a fuck about any of the characters, and that's why then when you get these 5-minute moments of them cutting wheat, or a 5-minute sex scene, it just feels very pointless, and I ended up sort of just laughing, and I'm like, well, what the fuck is this? Why am I spending 5 minutes here watching these two have sex, or, a group of people cut this wheat down, when I couldn't give a fuck about any of these characters' stories or journeys? And that was the biggest problem for me with Rebel Moon, both part 1 and part 2. I don't think the extended cut of part 2 really affected it that much. It didn't really add anything to it. In fact, it added a lot to it that I felt like they should have just left out. Like those fucking 5-minute, harvesting scenes, for example, in slow motion. But the reason why it just misses out on being number 10 is, I still enjoyed being immersed within this world. I enjoyed the detail of the world in which Snyder was bringing to life. There are aspects that I really appreciated about it, and as a result, the extended versions, mainly with the first part, do a much better job at immersing me into that world, even though it's quite familiar, and you'll sort of end up, you'll find yourself comparing it to a lot of other stories within film and video games and comics and all of that. There was just something about it that kind of kept me locked in because of the creativity and the imagination that's going on from a design perspective and sort of a world building perspective. And that's why the film, for me, both parts just narrowly missed being within my top 10. So I went on for a little bit longer than I intended there, but yeah. So let's dive straight into it. And in at number 10 was a very fascinating but frustrating experience, and that is Francis Ford Coppola's Megalopolis. This is a movie that, like I said, was a very frustrating experience because I kind of appreciated what it was that Francis Ford Coppola was attempting to do with this movie. I felt like it was quite ambitious in ways, but unfortunately, all these sort of the different elements and pieces of the story and sort of how they all come together just didn't quite work for me to create an experience that sort of just sucked you in, and so one that you could get really sort of emotionally swallowed up within with these characters and their journeys. It all just ended up feeling quite sort of soulless and weightless. At the same time, it was definitely an experience that grabbed my attention. Like, I was always sort of captivated by what was occurring on the screen and within the frame. Like, once you've sort of dug through the mess, you could sort of see what Francis Ford Coppola is trying to say you with this story. It's quite important, it's quite powerful, but it doesn't impact you as a viewer in that way. It's not emotionally powerful. Yes, you could see what he's trying to do, but like, for example, there's this powerful speech at the end of the movie, and it's probably one of the most effective moments within the film due to sort of how the emotions are evoked within that moment. But you've got this moment with Adam Driver giving this speech, and I found it to be quite moving. It was quite powerful, but it's only in that one moment. It's like a blip. And it kind of really sort of came to me within that moment of sort of what it was that Francis Ford Coppola was attempting you with this story. But due to how it's crafted, how the narrative is sort of constructed, it just fails to really it failed to take me along with it. And as a result, it's not one of those experiences that by the end of it all, leaves me going, wow, like, that was incredible, that was powerful, that was moving. It doesn't do that. But it did leave me very curious and very fascinated about what it was that I just sat through. So yeah, Megalopolis is in at number 10 for me. And in at number 9 is probably, just like my number 10 movie really, Megalopolis, was probably one of the biggest disappointments of last year. Because, these are both movies that I like the ideas behind them, I like the premise, I like what they were attempting to do, but they just don't quite come together to create something that really worked for me. And that is Matthew Vaughn's Argyle. I was incredibly disappointed with this movie. I'm a big fan of Matthew Vaughn as a director, and for me, this just felt like a Matthew Vaughn movie watered down. At the same time, it was also like Matthew Vaughn times 10, or like a bargain bin version of Matthew Vaughn, or something like that, because it just was so ridiculously over the top, but it kind of really lacked the charm, character and edge that I'm used to when it comes to Matthew Vaughn movies. And it just lacked any weight, soul, depth. The writing is terrible. Yeah, Argyle was a massive misfire for me. In many ways, it was still very much a Matthew Vaughn movie, but it just felt like Matthew Vaughn really didn't give a fuck about what it was that he was crafting you. That's how it felt, and it was just... you know, it was somewhat fun because of how absurd it gets. Like, it is ridiculous. You know, it was Matthew Vaughn times 10, but like I said, it kind of just, it lacked the character charm and edge of his previous movies. And even though I liked the ideas behind its story, I liked the premise, it's quite a basic, straightforward story that is stretched incredibly thin. The film was 2 hours and 20 minutes and I felt every moment of it. Really just didn't need to be that long. In many ways, it kind of reminded me of a Michael Bay Transformers movie, where you've got a pretty straightforward plot, but it's stretched incredibly thin over 3 hours. That's how Argylle kind of felt to me. You know, there are still moments within it that I kind of had fun with, but yeah.
That is one big pile of shit.
It's one of those movies, so yeah. Argylle is in at number 9 for me. In at number 8 is Venom: The Last Dance. I probably enjoyed this one the most when it comes to the movies within Sony's Spider-Man universe. You know, the Spider-Man universe without Spider-Man, that universe. I just found myself enjoying this one more than sort of those other movies that might be in this list. A little bit higher up. But yeah, and a lot of that is just down to the fact that I really enjoyed Tom Hardy in this role. I liked the dynamic between Eddie Brock and Venom, and that was sort of the one aspect of this movie that kind of somewhat kept me locked in through the entire duration, even though it is quite a dull, weightless, soulless experience. I mean, it's very mundane like every other movie within this Sony Spider-Man universe, where they do a really great job at capturing sort of the 90s generic superhero vibe, giving it that kind of retro, nostalgic aesthetic to it all, which is okay, but that's about it. You know, Venom: The Last Dance was quite a chaotic experience, but not in a fun way. It was just down to sort of how the story is constructed. Again, it's another one of those experiences that just needed to be a little bit more refined and focused on what it is that what they want to do basically with its story and with its character's journey. It was one of those movies that kind of felt like they didn't really know what kind of movie they wanted to make. They weren't even sure if it was going to be the last Venom movie. Perhaps that's how it kind of somewhat felt while I was watching it. Just really didn't know what it was that they were doing with, or wanted to do with its story, and it really shows. But I was always locked in due to the fact that you've got Tom Hardy bringing this character to life, and I really did enjoy that dynamic between him and Venom. And so, like I said, like a lot of movies in this list, whether it be 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, they're all movies that had major issues and problems and some really big disappointments, but they weren't unwatchable either. And there are aspects about it, or about them, that I enjoyed. But for me personally, Venom: The Last Dance is definitely the strongest within the Sony Spider-Man universe without Spider-Man. So yeah, Venom: The Last Dance is in at number 8 for me. And in at number 7, got another Sony Spider-Man universe movie without Spider-Man, and that is Craven the Hunter. Another movie that wasn't unwatchable. I actually appreciated, again, sort of what they were attempting you with its story, with the character of Craven and his relationship with his father and his brother. Unfortunately, it kind of loses focus on that, and it becomes, like a lot of the other movies within this universe, just ends up becoming this messy, chaotic slog of an experience that's, you know, just very kind of okay, like very dull, very drab. I mean, this was an incredibly dull and mundane experience, but I was still locked in because of that aspect about Craven's story that I was very intrigued by. And not only that, you've got Aaron Taylor Johnson bringing his character to life, and I think he makes a good Craven. He is perhaps the strongest element within this movie. I also struggle to remember an action set piece within this movie, and a lot of that was down to sort of how those moments of action were constructed. They lacked any energy and momentum, and as a result they sort of just get lost among what is a very flat and dull experience. And so when you get those moments of action, at first they do sort of pique your interest. Like I was like, oh yes, you know, we're about to get something by you. And then it would just sort of very quickly spiral into nothing. Again, just like a blip, you could say, on sort of the heart monitor or the radar. Do you know what I mean? It's just, it sort of almost teases you into believing that you're going to get something fun, and then sort of sticks the middle finger up at you. That's how it kind of felt. So yeah, Craven the Hunter is in at number 7 for me. So, 2024 was also a strong year for the horror genre. We had some real gems last year that I really enjoyed, that I really adored. But we also unfortunately got quite a few duds. And one of those being, it's in at my number 6 spot here, and that's Night Swim. A movie with a very promising and interesting premise. They do a fantastic job with its setup, with setting its characters up, and so I really liked how they sort of give the swimming pool within the story its own character. Like, it felt like a character within this movie. It felt like its own sort of living entity, you could say, and I really appreciated that. But the movie massively derails going into its second act, and we just end up sort of sitting through what is a very paint-by-the-numbers, generic horror movie with all the classic horror tropes. And it, as a result, ended up becoming a very frustrating experience because you had such a strong setup with characters that I could feel myself actually caring for, and you had this sort of heart that was injected into the core of its story. But unfortunately, that heart just gets lost with all of the sort of the muddled mess that occurs during the second and third act. And so yeah, it's a big shame because this is one of those movies in this list. Again, it's not an unwatchable movie, and there's probably many of you out there that enjoy this a hell of a lot more than me. But I just don't feel like it was a movie that kind of follows through on the potential of what it could have been, that we are sort of promised with its premise and what is actually hinted at within its story, within that first act. It's like you get a lot of sort of interesting sort of ideas, but it's almost like they were just sort of afraid to kind of really give us something perhaps that was different, and we just end up falling down this hole of being within a very generic paint-by-the-numbers horror experience that really offered nothing new. And it just ended up being really, really disappointing. So yeah, Night Swim is in at number 6 for me. And then at number 5 is a very similar experience to what I had with Night Swim, and that is Imaginary. Another movie with a very sort of promising potential. I really liked the premise behind its story. It was very intriguing, and this is a horror movie that could have been, yes, familiar, but also very different, very fresh and new and creative. Unfortunately for me, it was far from that. It was the complete opposite, and I couldn't believe how they got such a promising, interesting premise so incredibly wrong. Like, it was a massive misfire. It was quite a dull experience that, like Night Swim, ends up becoming this kind of very generic paint-by-the-numbers horror movie that just felt like we'd seen it a million times before. The frustrating thing about this movie is the potential was there. It's there within the ideas, and I really liked where this movie could have gone. Like, it always impressed me that a movie titled Imaginary could be so incredibly dull. There is nothing imaginary about this experience from a creative perspective. It's just, that's probably the film's or one of the movie's biggest achievements, is for it to have such a promising premise, such an interesting premise, you know, titled Imaginary, to be one of the most uncreative and unimaginative experiences ever. So yeah, Imaginary is in at number 5 for me. And in at number 4 is Borderlands, a video game adaptation of a series of games of the same name. Games that I've never played before, but I am familiar with. They're these sort of fun, colourful, vibrant, violent games. And so with Borderlands, the movie, I was expecting something fun, entertaining, something sort of in the vein of Guardians of the Galaxy. I mean, that's how they really kind of marketed this film, as being sort of in the same sort of style, really, or vibe as Guardians of the Galaxy. And so even though I don't have an attachment there to the games in which it's based on, I was still somewhat looking forward to it. Unfortunately,
that is one big pile of shit.
As well as being massively miscast, with a choice of director that I just did not understand. Borderlands for me is a very uninspired experience. It's very dull, flat. It just wasn't any fun, and I'm bewildered by what attracted the cast to this material. The likes of Cate Blanchett and Jamie Lee Curtis, they're just so miscast. And like, you've got Jamie Lee Curtis, and there are a couple of moments with her character where even she looks like she's thinking to herself, what the fuck am I doing here? Like, there are a couple of moments where it literally looks like Jamie Lee Curtis is wondering herself, like she's on the set and she's going, where the fuck am I? Like, what am I doing here? That's how it felt. It just lacked any originality. It just, like I said, it just felt very uninspired. It wasn't fun, and it was just a giant shower of shit. So yeah, Borderlands is in at number 4 for me. In at number 3 is Baghead. Another movie that actually had quite an interesting premise and could have been effective. But this is another one of those horror movies last year that just really failed to deliver on what I did feel is, or was, quite an interesting premise, and something that, like, could have been, yes, familiar, but incredibly different. It's a failure on every level. There's no atmosphere. There's no horror. You got characters that you just can't get behind emotionally. The writing was absolutely terrible within this movie. Some of the worst writing that I'd experienced all year. I mean, it was soap opera kind of bad for me. Like, this felt like a horror episode special of Coronation Street or something. That's how Baghead felt. Like, there are sort of small glimmers of light here and there with sort of what the film could have been. It also reminded me a little bit of Talk to Me. That was a movie that takes a very familiar subgenre within horror, but does something very different, and it was very refreshing to experience with a character that you could get behind emotionally. You could have had the same thing, but like I said, it just failed on every level. Baghead for me was one of the worst experiences of the year. So yeah, Baghead is in at number 3 for me. And in at number 2 is another movie with a very interesting premise, with a lot of potential, and that is Afraid. This is a movie that I don't feel like was heavily marketed, and I caught it kind of very last minute. I think I seen the first trailer about 2 weeks before the movie was released, but it got my interest because I really liked the idea behind the story about this AI sort of taking over this family home. And I was like, wow, I mean, the possibilities there that you could achieve, when it comes to the horror genre by utilising artificial intelligence. Unfortunately, again,
that is one big pile of shit.
A massive failure on every level. It's a movie that starts off with what is a very interesting idea and then kind of spirals into a load of nonsense. Instead of sort of retaining his focus on sort of what would make the story more involving, more emotionally powerful and more intriguing, as well as create an atmosphere, it just loses all of that, and it just ends up... Afraid was like a series of events that all just didn't quite meld together to create one cohesive whole. You had all these kind of different aspects to its story, these sort of different things going on with different characters within their story, and they all just didn't quite work together as one film. And it did feel like at times we had a couple of different movies on the go here while watching Afraid. The writing was terrible. In fact, the writing kind of felt like it was actually written by an AI. That's how it felt. It kind of felt like a tech manual or a live adaptation of a tech manual. Like, that's how mechanical everything felt about the movie, even down to the way the cast were directed in certain scenes, like just the way they would deliver certain lines within certain moments. It all just felt very cold and robotic, to the point where actually I did wonder, was it intentional? Because it was that bad. It was that soulless. So yeah, Afraid is in at number 2 for me. And in at number 1 is a movie, actually I was quite torn to put either this one as number 2 and have Afraid as number 1, because they're both equally just as bad. But I felt like this one just tops it. And you've probably already guessed what it is. It's Madam Web. Yes, another Sony Spider-Man universe without Spider-Man. But this was just a failure on like every level. Just from the way the camera would be used to how the moments were edited. It was just very awkward. Like, it's almost like they had this kind of cut of the movie. They looked at it and went, fuck, there's no energy here, there's just no momentum here. And so what they attempted to do was to try and inject this artificial momentum and energy into the movie by sort of editing the movie in a way that would hopefully give it that kinetic energy that they were hoping for, as well as sort of like zooming in on certain things. And it was just a very bizarre experience in how it played out and in how it constructed. Like, the final product felt like something that was engineered as an afterthought, because they realised that the movie was such an incredibly bland, dull and slow, and the writing again is just incredibly soulless. It kind of just lacks any sort of humanity. It was quite wooden. Like, you'd have a scene with the villain where he goes to one of these characters, you must do this or I will kill you. You know, it was that bad, to the point where when you get movies this bad, I can't help but feel sometimes as if maybe it was intentional. Like, are we actually capable of making something this bad? You know, it kind of just makes me think, are they purposely attempting to sort of recreate or recapture a certain type of movie, maybe from a certain era? You know, those bargain bin kind of straight to VHS movies from the 80s or the 90s. I really don't know what Madam Web was. I mean, there were moments that kind of made me laugh because it was so bad. Like the final act, where you get sort of its climax. It was just the way it played out was just so awkward, and you'd have this sort of very kind of choppy editing, and you'd have the fucking camera doing all of this sort of kind of movement, and like that aspect of it just made it feel all kind of artificial and engineered, because they knew what they had you, what they'd shot was just not effective enough, and so they tried to sort of in post kind of try and save the entire experience. But yeah, unfortunately, Madam Web was one of the dullest, blandest, painful experiences of last year, and it's in at number 1 for me. So yeah, they are my worst movies of 2024, but what do you guys think? Do you agree or disagree with anything I've said or any of my choices? Or what are your worst movies of 2024? Let me know below and let's get a discussion going. And if you've made it this far into the video, then thank you so much. I really do appreciate it. And if you want to watch future movie reviews and just general movie talk from some random Welsh geek in Wales rambling on, then please hit the subscribe button. It will mean an awful lot to me. I do have another top 10 list on the way, and that's going to be my top 10 favourite scores of 2024. I've never done one of these before, but it's one that I really want to share with you all because music for me plays a big part in the movie going experience. Music in general, I'm just a massive fan of. I'm very passionate about, but it's something that I've been really wanting to talk about, and there were a lot of soundtracks last year that I just really found myself admiring, and I'm looking forward to sharing those with you. I've also got, or will have, a review for Baby Girl, which will be released here in the UK on Friday, so that'll be my next movie review as well. So yeah, another big thank you to all of those that have subscribed recently and connected to the channel. It really means an awful lot to me, and it will always overwhelm me that so many of you do want to follow just some random Welsh geek ramble on about film. But I really do appreciate it, and I just love doing this, and I'm looking forward to sort of growing my channel now into 2025. So yeah, thank you guys for watching. I really do appreciate it, and I'll be catching you guys soon.